To avoid the video going too long, I decided to break this one into two parts, which I hadn't anticipated, but the first one was starting to get quite lengthy. So we're just going to pick up here where we left off in part one. Next up, we have vocabulary and context. This tends to be an easier question, and most people enjoy this one, but there are some mistakes that I've seen people make, and you don't want to throw away an easy point if you can help it. So how does this question look? Usually on the GRE, it's going to be phrased in the context in which it appears the word blank in such and such line most nearly means which of the following, or replacement of the word blank with which would result in the least change in meaning for the passage. So in both cases, and in any other cases that you see it, essentially they're saying, right, if you pluck that word out and you put one of these five words in, which one is going to mean the same thing? And so the first strategy, maybe even the only strategy, really is to just do that, right? Take each of your options, plug them into the sentence, read it through, and see which one means the same thing as the original word. And one of the big mistakes that people make is that they don't do this, and they just look at the choices and they say, well, this one is the nearest synonym to the word. The problem is that words have very different meanings given the context of the sentence that they're in. And so very often all five options will be dictionary synonyms with the word, but given the context, only one of them has nearly the same meaning. Another less common mistake is that people will plug the five words in and then just pick the one that they feel reads best, which is not correct either, right? Even though maybe by plugging a word in, the sentence seems to flow really well, if the meaning has changed at all, then it's not the right choice. Right. So first and foremost, the word that you plug in needs to have the exact same meaning as the one that you pulled out. Let's take a look at one of the questions from the test. Take a little time, read through, answer this question. All right. Replacement of the word passive, line 5, with which of the following words results in the least change in meaning for the passage? So just from the sentence setup, we know that we're dealing with vocab and context. We just need to match the meaning of passive given this context. So looking at our options, a lot of them could mean the same thing as passive, right? To be passive can mean that you're disinterested. It can also mean that you're submissive, right? If someone is acting passive, they might be unreceptive. If someone is laying around in a passive way, they might be supine, right? So there's a lot of ways in which these words could mean the same thing. So we have to go to the text. If we look at the line, it says Renaissance prints the position regards Renaissance prints as passive representations of their time, documents that reliably record contemporary events, opinions, and beliefs. So the word we want here is that they were accurate, they were reliable, right? They didn't have any bias, they didn't try to change things, they were just accurate. And so the best synonym is definitely A, disinterested. Right? Even though those other words could mean the same thing as passive, we need a word that matches the meaning of this sentence, right? So if we read it back, the position regards Renaissance prints as disinterested representations of their time, documents that reliably record contemporary events, opinions, and beliefs. And it gives us the exact same meaning. The next type of question we want to look at is select all that apply. So this really refers to the directions, which you'll see. It'll say, consider each of the following choices and select all that apply. The question itself might read like the passage suggests, it might read like the purpose of a line, it might read like inference, but you have to sort of shift your thinking because you're not just dealing with one question now, you're kind of dealing with three separate true or false questions, right? Which of the following accurately answers the question? So again, just like before, we're avoiding absolutes or those overreaching answers, but just a note of caution, this is a type of question I see a lot of people get stuck on, and they just sort of freeze up and they waste too much time, right? There's more ways to answer this question than the other questions, right? There are actually 7 different ways to answer this question because you can either pick 1, 2, or 3 of the answers. So just make sure that you're not wasting too much time and that, if you do get stuck, this is one of those questions where it might be good to just get your best guess down, move on, and then come back to it if you have time left over. So let's return to that medium passage that we were looking at before, except this time we have a different question. So if you didn't get a chance to read it before, or you just want to go back over it, go for that now. And let's look at this. So the passage suggests that an adherent to the orthodox position, line 3, would agree with which of the following statements. So if we go back all the way to the the very first video on reading comprehension, right? One of the strategies that we're using with medium passages is we're trying to identify, are there different views, right? Is there a traditional view and a new view, right? An orthodox view and some sort of radical change. And here we can see that there is an orthodox position. And it says that this position regards Renaissance prints as passive representations of their time. And then further down, in contrast, pioneering studies such as those by Scribner and Moxie take a strikingly different approach, saying that all the way down near the bottom, they function as popular propaganda, tools in a vigorous campaign aimed at altering people's behavior, attitudes, and beliefs. All right, so there is this dichotomy between the orthodox position, that we can look at these prints and say, yeah, that's what people thought, and this new position, sort of saying, no, those prints are often propaganda. They were trying to convince people to believe something different. So what we have to do now is go look at these three options and see which ones are true, which ones are false. And right away, we can see that A definitely has to be right. It says the orthodox position can be said to have emerged. This position regards Renaissance prints as passive representations of their time. Well, that's precisely what A says, so that one's definitely true. B, Northern Renaissance prints were part of a campaign aimed at altering contemporary thinking? No, right? That's the new view. That's the contrast that Scribner and Moxie have taken up. So that one's wrong. And then C, Northern Renaissance prints provide reliable records of contemporary events, opinions, and beliefs. Again, that's almost just a restatement of precisely what has been described to us as the orthodox position. So it's going to be A and C here. The next type of question we want to look at is select the sentence. So this is the one on the computerized test where you click on a line to highlight it. And the question will often be worded in a bit of a convoluted way with sort of several qualifiers strung together, right? So here, which sentence presents a misconception that the passage challenges? Or which sentence contains evidence for a critical view that the passage dismisses? So every word in this question matters, right? So if we look at that second one, which sentence contains evidence for a critical view that the passage dismisses? We kind of need to work backwards through that, right? So there needs to be you need to figure out, well, what is the passage trying to say, right? What has it dismissed? So what is this critical view that the passage has dismissed? And then which line contains the evidence for that view that the passage dismissed, right? And so every word there matters. You can't just pick the line that has the critical view, right? You don't want to pick the line where the passage dismisses the critical view, right? You need to pick the line that contains the evidence for the view that gets dismissed by the passage. And I know this is a bit silly, but don't forget to click on an answer. I have definitely worked with people who didn't realize that what was going on was they needed to click one of the sentences and they just sort of click through. So if we look at what the question will look like, right, there isn't a question on the right side. There isn't any bubbles to click on. What you'll do is you'll just move your mouse over here and click on one of the lines. So again, go ahead, pause the video, read through this one, and try to answer this question. Select the line that presents a misconception that the passage challenges. So when reading through, again, the main idea of this one, right, is that there is this common belief. People thought at one point that Europeans needed to transform chocolate. However, the author then presents all this information to sort of say, by the end, conclude there is no indication that Spaniards deliberately tried to change the original flavor of chocolate, right? They were just simply replacing the sweetener with one that they had more readily. So, which line presents the misconception that the passage challenges? So, this one's actually pretty straightforward. It's got to be that second line, or that second sentence. There is a common belief, right? A misconception is usually a common belief, right? That Europeans needed to transform chocolate to make it appetizing, right? And especially because the line after says, however. So we know that the author is then going to go on and challenge this common belief. So it fits the descriptors pretty nicely. And the last family of questions we're going to look at is the which of the following if true, which more generally is just the critical reading passages or the logical reasoning passages. So very often you can recognize these because it's a short paragraph and the question reads which of the following if true undermines or supports or strengthens or weakens the author's argument or conclusion. It can also read other ways. It can say the argument depends on which of the following or something like that. Now, I know I have a lot listed here as far as strategies, and that's because this one I find people have the greatest difficulty with, especially if you're approaching this the same way that you approach the other questions. This one is very different from those. So I've talked about it before, but when you're reading through these passages, you want to read like a devil's advocate, right? You want to read in a skeptical way, right? You want to think, the author came to this conclusion, but how did they get there, right? Are they trying to mislead me? Have they left out information? Have they forgot to include something that's really important for them to reasonably hold the conclusion that they do? So something you want to do is isolate the author's argument. It's usually the last sentence, not always, but usually it'll say, right, therefore, it can be concluded that blank, right? Or it is obvious that such and such, right? So when you have this last line, this argument, that's precisely what the question is asking you to respond to. In some ways, this question is very similar to the argument essay task, and there are a couple sort of things to look out for. Oftentimes, the wrong answers will be one of two things. They'll either be something that seems already true and therefore doesn't really have any bearing on the argument, right? If something's already true, it can't undermine if it's already been acknowledged, right? It can't support something either if it's already true, right? We need something that's new information. And so if an answer just looks like a restatement of the facts that are already there, rule it out. But also, on the other hand, you want to rule out things that are completely tangential, right? Completely way out in left field that have nothing to do with the argument. The problem here is that a lot of people confuse the correct answer for something that is completely tangential. The correct answer does seemingly have nothing to do with the passage because it is a new piece of information, right? The only thing that could possibly be introduced and then serve to undermine or to strengthen an argument is if it's something that didn't already exist in the passage. Just a note, if you really want to do well on these questions or you're finding that you're having a lot of trouble and you need more practice, I would go to some of the practice LSAT material out there and look for their logical reasoning sections. So actually half of the entire LSAT test is made up of questions that look pretty much like the GRE's critical reasoning questions. And I'll leave a link to it. We can actually go and look at one of their practice tests. So if we take a look at a practice LSAT test, you can ignore this first section. This is the logic game section, but section 2 here is entirely comprised of these logical reasoning questions, right? You're given a paragraph setup and then a question asking about some sort of logical reasoning associated with it. And really, if you look at some of these, right, which of the following, if true, would most seriously weaken the argument? Which of the following most logically completes the argument? These are exactly the types of questions you're going to see on the test. And so these questions are even a little more difficult than the GRE, so if you can work through a section or two of logical reasoning on the LSAT and feel confident on this question, you're going to be fine on the GRE. So to practice, let's go ahead and take a look at two logical reasoning questions. So this one, then you can go ahead and pause it, work through this one, and a second one here. So take a few minutes for each one and try to come up with an answer. So taking a look at this first question, we won't read through the whole thing, but that last line is very important. Right here it says, even if the manufacturer's claim is true, given that the availability of sugar-free foods did not reduce sugar consumption, and right here, this is the conclusion, it is unlikely that the availability of these fat-free foods will reduce fat consumption. So the author has concluded, the author has made the argument, it is unlikely that the availability of fat-free foods will reduce fat consumption. So that is what we are looking to respond to. Looking at the question, which of the following, if true, most seriously undermines the argument? Okay, so we want something that works against that, that sort of shows that the author's conclusion is not reliable, right? And if we look through some of these answers, which hopefully you already have, a couple of them can kind of be eliminated. Like I said, things that just already seem true. Like for instance, E. Not all foods containing fat can be produced in fat-free versions. That's probably true, but it doesn't really have any bearing here, right? Maybe also A. Several kinds of fat substitutes are available to manufacturers. Seems true, each of which gives a noticeably different taste and texture to products that contain it. Again, something that already seems true but doesn't really seem to have much of an effect. All right. And then if we look at an answer like C, the food brought out The foods brought out in sugar-free versions did not generally have reduced levels of fat, but many of the fat-free versions about to be introduced are low in sugar. This doesn't really have any bearing. This is completely tangential, right? We aren't really told that we care about foods that are both containing or not containing fat and sugar, right? That's just here they're just trying to throw in a bunch of like buzzwords from the passage to get you thinking that, hey, maybe this has some sort of effect. The correct answer here is going to be B. The products made with artificial sweeteners did not taste like products made with sugar. And for some of you, you're thinking, what? How does that have anything to do with this? But if we look, right, what we're looking for is, well, why does the author assume this? Why does the author assume that this fat-free food isn't going to work? Why aren't people going to buy fat-free foods instead of the ones with fat? Well, they said it's because sugar-free foods didn't make people stop buying sugar-full foods, right? However, the passage says, now manufacturers are introducing fat-free versions of various foods that they claim have the taste and texture of the traditional high-fat versions. Okay, so fat-free foods taste like the high-fat versions. But if B is true, that the sugar-free foods didn't taste like the high-sugar versions, then it isn't make a good comparison. It isn't a good reason to assume that the same thing is going to happen with fat as happened with sugar. So that's why it has a bearing on this, right? So it is a new piece of information that is relevant to the conclusion the author has arrived at. Taking a look at our second logical reasoning question. Again, we want to isolate what is the author's argument. The author is saying, consequently, once the housing is occupied, the annual number of forest deer hit by cars will be much higher than before construction started. So the author is telling us that once people move into these houses, once they finish building all these houses, there's going to be more people driving through, and these deer, which love to be at the edge of the forest, they're going to get hit by cars. And so because there's more people, there's going to be more collisions with deer. Seems great, right? However, it says which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends. So again, we want to read this one, we want to think about this one like, so this author has made a conclusion, but they've left something out that they needed to fully justify their conclusion. So which answer choice is going to give us that new information, that piece of information that the author left out that they should have included? So right away we can eliminate some unrelated information. So like A, we don't care about commercial vehicles. E, we don't care about hunting, right? Those things are just too far out in left field. They don't have any bearing on this. B might have been tempting, right? Deer will be as attracted to the forest edge around new houses as to the forest edge alongside roads. But again, this is something that either doesn't have any bearing or is kind of already true, right? So they've already told us that deer feed at the edge of the forests, right? And they've told us that they will be attracted to the spaces besides the houses, right? But just telling us that their attraction to these places is equal doesn't really give us any new information, at least none that's relevant. And another wrong one would be C. It says in years past, the annual number of deer that have been hit on these roads has been very low. So again, that might seem good, like it'd be nice to know that, but that doesn't necessarily, the argument doesn't depend on that, right? Whether or not the level of deer being hit has been low or high or in the middle, it can still be much higher than before, right? So that's the author's argument, is just that the number of deer hit is going to be much higher than before. And that doesn't mean that it had to be low before. It can be high and then get much higher, right? So that one's not going to work either. The correct answer is D. The development will leave sufficient forest to sustain a significant population of deer. And I think this one can sometimes give you that feeling of like, what? Like, I guess obviously that's true, but it's not something that was mentioned, but it's something that you assumed, and you need that in order to actually assume that the argument is true, right? So after they've cut down this forest, put in all these houses, if the number of deer that are going to get hit is going to go up, then there have to be deer living in this forest. And that's what D is saying, right? We have to be able to assume that deer can still live in this forest. And that concludes this video on the question stems and families on the reading comprehension section. I hope that was helpful. I know that there was a lot of reading to get done there and a lot of problems to work through, but if you stuck it out till now, thank you. And if you have any other questions, leave them below and I'll try to get back to you. And I hope that you will join me in the next video when we look at sentence equivalents and finish up with this verbal section.